All right, so with that abomination over and done with, I'll obviously just have to try to... All right, I'm not sure why that was so horrible, but apparently it just doesn't take all the changes that I had because I switched that question. All right, so the big thing that we're going to be dealing with this week is list methods. All right, so each of these, so this is actually a pretty good guide. So next week is your first, so not this lab, but next lab is your first timed lab, which is about 3% of your grade. So not much, but at the same time, you know, it's nice to have that 3% taken care of there. Yeah, week from, yeah. So not this Thursday, but next Thursday. Now the great thing about this one is that the difficulty here, I'm hoping it's going to be around this difficulty, right? That's what I'm aiming for under the advice of my TAs, that the difficulty is around the difficulty for these problems over here, which also happens to be around the difficulty of the questions on the exam. Okay, so I think that's pretty fair for this thing. The hardest thing over here is actually going to be learning how to get the syntax down, and so I'm going to give you like advice on how to write the headers for the first couple problems, and then you'll be able to use that because that's where I saw students struggle in the past, writing the headers for these methods, because you haven't dealt with methods that just deal with generics, right, or that deal with generic lists or anything like that, right? So a method can have generics as well. And I go through a pretty thorough write-up of this, but essentially we get an error here if we try to do it like this. Public static Boolean, right? This is a list of E's. I'm not sure what the type is going to be, right? And I want to know, yeah, suppose I'm writing this method called in, which says, hey, is this item in this list? Everybody kind of understand the concept? Hey, you know, basically the contains method, right? Right? It's going to return true otherwise. And if you put this into Java, this will give you an error because it's saying, hey, I don't know what E is. Where did you declare E that, you know, that's as your generic object, right? As your generic type. So what you can do is you can declare a different generic type for each method if you want it. And it will only exist for that method. And the way you do that is by putting an E between the static and the type. It's a fairly straightforward thing to do to fix it, but it looks weird, right? I think nobody's going to disagree that it looks a bit weird. This is the way to do this, right? If I pump this into my IDE, right? If I pump this into my IDE, it's going to tell me, hey, that's an error, right? See how it just lit up nice and red for me? Cannot resolve symbol E. So the way I resolve it and say, hey, E is a generic type, I put it E. Now, you don't have to use E. If that's not your favorite letter of the alphabet, you can use whatever your favorite letter of the alphabet it is, right? There's nothing stopping me. And now, right now, it's telling me that my error is that I don't return a Boolean, so I'm just going to return false right now, right? Always a good. So now that's fine. Let me go ahead and just show you, right? Lights up here, and it says, hey, you don't have a generic type, right? You're saying there's a generic type, but I can't figure out what that symbol is, right? There's no, right now actually what I was doing is saying I'm looking for a class called E. I'm looking for a class of E's, right? Did you write in a class called E somewhere? That's what the cannot resolve type. And here you're telling it, well, actually E is my symbol for generic, right? You don't have to use E. I could totally use T instead if I wanted to. I'm a big fan of using E though. Not sure what, yep, there we go. That went away. So, and this is if you are taking in, now when do you use this? You use this when you are taking in a list, when you're writing a method, and it takes in a list, right? But you don't know what that list could be, right? It could be any type, but you know they're all going to be the same type, right? Worst case scenario, you can say a list of objects if you're just taking in a list of objects. But here it allows the user to put in if you're making no assumptions about what it is except they're all the same, you can just put in E here. Now the opposite of that, or sorry, not opposite, but when you don't want to use that is when you know your list is going to take in something. So for instance, let's go ahead and I'm going to write a method that takes in a list. Okay, public static sum int sum, right, which takes in a list of integers. Okay? Now, sum takes in a list of integers, right? It's going to sum up all the items in the list, right? That's just like we would for an array, right? Right? Now, because, and right now I've just got to, I'm going to return -1 just simply because I'll quash the error that way. Now, because this is a list of integers, and we know because we know this list contains integers, and integers an actual class, right? We can use this, right? We can use anything that's, we can use any list here. We can use an array list, or as we'll learn later, a linked list, and this will run through it. So for, and I'll just simply write for integer, actually I can put int I in list, sorry, L was it, then I'll have an int sum is equal to 0, sum plus equals I, return sum, right? Right, so here it's just iterating through, so for every integer I in the list L, take that value I and add it to sum. Return sum, yes?
I understand how in main or wherever you can determine what data type you're actually using by using the diamond
Yes.
brackets and writing in string or whatever and declaring your variable.
Yes.
But since all the methods are defined in this generic class,
Yeah.
in main, how would you designate what data type any given method you want to?
Excellent question. So all I do is just simply give it the variables that I need. I think your concerns are not a concern. So let's go ahead and say I've got a list. So first off, I'm going to create an array list of integers. List is equal to new array list. Oops. And let me go ahead and do alt. Okay. And I'll just do the generic completion over there. So import class. Right? So I've created a new list. I'm not going to bother populating it. I'm not going to bother finishing my method. Let me go ahead and scroll up. Right? I thought this presentation mode would be a good idea. It turns out actually no, with the way that I've upped the font size, that actually it turned out to be a terrible idea. So let me exit it. There we go, much better, because it scaled everything else up. All right, so what we're going to do now is that I can sout, well, actually I won't even bother souting it. I'm just going to say, since the return type's a Boolean, I'm just going to say Boolean B is equal to in list n5, right? Right, and it just detects it automatically. Right? You say, because it's an array list of integers, it can parse that out. And I can pass in an array list here, right? Because an array list is a list, right? So I can just pass it in here. Does that make sense to everybody? I can pass in an array list. The list over here is an array list, and I can pass it into the in method because an array list is a list, right? That's the power of polymorphism there, right? So anything that's a list I can pass into this method because I'm guaranteed that the list, and then I can use all the list methods because I'm guaranteed that anything that is a list has these methods in it. Similarly for sum, right? If I were to create an array list of double over here, L2 is equal to new array list, right? Sum, and again, I can't, if I pass in L2, or if I pass it into that method, it's going to call me out on it and says, hey, you know, a list, you know, you can't take this list of integers and try to turn it into a list of, you know, a list of doubles, right? It just doesn't work that way. We don't do that kind of mass conversion. Right. And besides, it also gets into wrapper classes, so it makes it kind of messy. So it just doesn't do that, right? This takes in an array list of integers. So to summarize, you only use the generic here if you're using generics, right? You don't know it's a list of what type. I don't know what type's going into the method. If you know what type's going to be into the method, and I'll tell you, most of the time it's integers, right? You put it in there. So your 5 methods are uniqueness. This unique takes in a list, and returns true if all the items in the list are unique. All the items are unique if none of them are the same. How do you know if they're the same or not? Use the dot equals method. That's what my footnote says. Sameness is defined by if the dot equals method is true, then returns true, then those things are the same. Okay. All multiples. So this will give me a list of integers and an int. It will return a new list that contains all the numbers from the input list, which are multiples of the given integer. For example, if the list is 1, 25, 2, 5, 30, 19, 57, 2, and 25, and you give me 5, I'm going to give out a list that only has the multiples of 5, which were 25, 5, 30, and 25. So remember that to use the modulo operator, right? All strings of size, which given a list of strings, an integer length, gives me all the strings of a particular length. So if I give you this, I like to eat apples and bananas, and 3, you give me eat, and, which are all the strings that have 3, right? Don't have to worry about the repeats there, right? Is permutation, which takes in 2 list objects that contain the same type, so you want to use your generics there. Returns true if the lists are permutations of each other, and false if they're not. 2 lists are permutations if they contain the same elements, including the same number of duplicates, but they don't have to contain the same elements in the same order, right? So 1, 2, and 4, and 2, 1, and 4 are permutations of each other, but 1, 1, 2, 4 is not a permutation of either of those, right? Because you've got to have the same number of items and the same number of duplicates, okay? And that one's a bit tricky because I haven't taught you about hash maps, which is the optimal way to solve that one. So that one's a bit tricky. To be bluntly honest, the problem 4 and problem 6 are the ones that are the trickiest. So 5, string to a list of words, gives me a string and converts it into a list of word. We assume that every word in the input string is separated by white space. So if I give you, for instance, hello, my name is Andrew, right, all separated by spaces, then you return, hello, my name is Andrew. Each is a different element, right? And so what you want to look up, and I give you a footnote here about what's going to help you here, which is the split method, right? And this is also an invitation for you to learn about regular expressions, which will come up again in this class. They are not necessary to succeed in this class. However, your life is much easier knowing regular expressions, and almost every programming language utilizes regular expressions. They're very useful tools, and in fact, there's an argument to be made that the first thing you teach in programming should be regular expressions rather than actual programming. All right. So yeah, if the string is hello world, then the output should be hello, comma, world with an exclamation point, okay? Now there's extra credit available if you sanitize the screen, cleaning it up so that the punctuation and everything and all the extraneous stuff is removed. So for instance, the above would become hello and world. Now this one, you want to return a list of strings, obviously. So that one's a bit different. You want to return a list of strings, okay? Now the final thing you want to do, now this is the final one, which is also which is slightly tricky, but if you read the footnotes, you'll figure out what the trick is. Write a method called remove all instances, which takes in a list and an item. The method then proceeds to remove each item in the list that matches a given item. For example, if I'm giving you a list of integers, 1, 4, 5, 6, 5, 5, 2, and I also give you the integer 5 to remove, then it removes all 5s from the list, so it will become 1, 5, 6, 2. It shouldn't return anything because you're changing the list that you pass in, right? Just like if you pass in an array and make changes to it, you don't need to change the array. Now the big thing over here, right, down here is that this one's tricky because you'll have to keep in mind that removing an item shifts the indexes, and I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. The big thing here also is that in order to make sure it works, test it on this case. Test it on giving me a list with these items in it and trying to remove 5. And if you can successfully do it, it's going to work. And if you have 5s left over still, you're going to still then you found the pitfall. So each of these are worth 15 points. Okay, the easy ones are worth no more than the hard ones, and the hard ones are worth no more than the easy ones. So 5 points for each method is using the generics correctly, right? So you need to use the generics. So just by using the generics correctly, that works. So just doing these is 90 points. Making sure your code doesn't resemble a massive pile of spaghetti, right? That's 10 points. And honestly, that's pretty free because you can just use the auto format feature. So on Eclipse, that's Control-A, Control-I to indent all your code. For other IDEs like NetBeans, that's a matter of right-clicking and say Format My Code. So that should be easy. And then 5 extra points over here. To demo this work, you need to explain how you solved this one, remove all instances, and then we're gonna tell you another one to explain how you solved it. Okay? So to demo it, you just got to explain 2 of them. One of which I told you what it was, and the other one it's gonna just depend on which one we feel like you particularly we want to show you. Okay, so with that, you guys could get started on that, and that's what we're doing today. And if you've got questions on that, and technically since the Rabbits do tonight, you can also ask me all questions about that. If I see that people need more time on that, I will adjust the time. If you really do need more time, and you are embarrassed to say so in class, just send me an email and tell me, hey, we need more time.
Is this individual thing?
This one is, so does everybody, that's a great question. Does everybody have a laptop to work on? Does everybody have something to work on their own? Okay. If everybody does, then this one will be an individual assignment. Although that does not stop you from chatting with your neighbor and about how to solve this. But this time you would, there's nothing, I highly encourage that you chat with your neighbor, discuss how to solve these problems. Okay, but this one you'll be submitting your own code and demoing it by yourself.